Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Over the weekend, violence against police officers. Of course, in McAllen, Texas, 2 police officers shot and killed by a suspect who later fatally shot himself, responding to a domestic disturbance call.
Oh, those are the calls that they want the social workers to go on that are not armed. Mm-hmm.
If you're a social worker, be happy you didn't get dispatched to that call, huh? In North Carolina, High Point, North Carolina, police officers swarmed by a hostile crowd of 50 people after searching a home during a drug bust. This was police responding to a search of an address on the 1100 block of Campbell Street in High Point, North Carolina, when a hostile crowd of 50 people showed up in front of the residence, according to a local TV station. As officers were trying to leave the property after making some arrests, they seized 15 grams of marijuana, 85 grams of heroin. For those of you who just want to talk about marijuana, although that should be legal. How about heroin? Okay. Anyway, there were drugs in the house. They searched the house. They made arrests, and they were confronted by 50 people who were hostile, as so described, began blocking the driveway, swarming a squad car to prevent it from leaving. Officers ultimately had to use pepper spray to disperse the mob so they could take the suspects into the station, both of whom were charged with felony trafficking of heroin. That's North Carolina. In New York City, we have video released of an incident between New York City police officers and a mob that was protesting on July 1st in advance of 4th of July weekend. And the unrest that was going on in the Bronx, this is the Bronx, as well as around the country during that time period. And to give you a sense of it, so you have 2 police officers trying to subdue one protester who had got violent, and then another protester comes close to one of the police officers and, threatens his safety because he's like coming up from behind him, and he's staying there, and he's like pointing, and he's making gesticulations that are aggressive. So the police officer engages him, and they get into a wrestling match. The assailant has him in a headlock for a time period, and then ultimately lets him go and flees. But the commentary from the person shooting the video that was posted online is what you want to hear to get a sense of the attitude that police are dealing with on the streets in certain areas around the country. A lot of areas around the country, it seems.
Right here, he act gangster because he got a badge and a gun. Out of here, y'all niggas is bro. Y'all wildin', yeah. Y'all wildin', bro. Look, bro. Look, bro. Look, bro. Look, bro. What's up with you, bro? What's up with you, bro? What's up with you, bro? Yeah, him up, Rata, him up. Out of here. Out of here. Out of here. Out of here. Yeah, hold that. Yeah, hold that. Yeah, hold that. Yeah, hold that. Yeah, hold that.
Dear Lord, why would anybody want to be a police officer? My gosh.
The officer in question who was engaged in this confrontation needed 2 staples to close cuts in his head. The assailant was identified as a 29-year-old. He later surrendered himself along with his lawyer. He was charged by police.
With what?
And then Bronx DA, Bronx District Attorney Darcel Clark offered deferred prosecution, meaning the suspect remains free.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
As prosecutors continue to investigate the case and decide whether or not charges are merited, even though he engaged in a physical altercation with the police officer. Okay, and then we're curious as to why crime is spiking in major urban centers where we have seen significant unrest and lawlessness in the context of the political civilian response to it. Yeah, it's a real mystery. For more on this, we're pleased to be joined by James Casey. He's a former police officer and FBI agent, served on the National Security Council, and retired as special agent in charge of the FBI's Jacksonville decision. He's currently president of FCS Global Advisors, a private investigative and crisis management firm. James Casey, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, good morning. Thank you.
So what about the situation with police right now and the focus on cutting budgets, defunding police, the sort of non-prosecution culture in places like New York and Philadelphia and Chicago and San Francisco? How does that translate to the frontline police officer working a beat?
So, I think this is kind of a one-sided story, and we're seeing just one side of it. I like to say there's a overwhelming silent majority of people who not only love and support their police, just can't disagree with what we're seeing in most of the media. It really does make it tough on these men and women that are on the front lines, especially in these big cities where there's a lot of violence. And, we see it with the increase in, call outs, the increase in retirements. Many of these cities are not going to be able to recruit even if they had slots. And we saw where in New York, over 1,000 officers have been canceled for going to the next recruit class in July. So, I don't see how this gets any better. The crime's only going to get worse in these places. But, again, I think that the overwhelming majority of people really do support the police.
Well, just AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, speaking of New York, since we profiled New York case there, she says, look, James, you got $6 billion, and we've seen this uptick in crime. So the $6 billion isn't doing it. So why shouldn't we cut $1 billion or more and reimagine policing? Because, you guys aren't getting the job done.
So I started in law enforcement in 1981 in a very progressive department. And I mean progressive in terms of having resources and thinking strategically and doing things differently and having equipment and things like that. And I was in Arlington, Virginia, and it still is a progressive department. And really from 1981 until I left in 1986, we had social workers. They were county workers, county employees that worked for social services, and we had them on shifts. They would ride with officers and deploy to calls if a social worker could lend itself to the situation, and sometimes it did. I can tell you one downside of the program was there was never enough. We didn't have them all the time on midnight shifts, sometimes on late evening shifts. There were never enough, but they were always with a police officer. If you follow the news in St. Petersburg, Florida, they have moved very aggressively to get rid of $3.1 million in federal money and another $3.6 million that they were going to co-contribute to hire 25 police officers in lieu of putting out a contract to hire a private company that will provide these social workers. And the chief has listed 13 different incidents that these social workers will, deploy to instead of the police. And they're all things like intoxicated person, drug overdose, suicide, neighborhood disputes. My prediction is many of these things, they're going to be sending a police officer anyway. And then, by the way, they're going to have 25 fewer of them to send. I read in the paper over the weekend that these social workers in St. Petersburg will be working 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. So that leaves another, 14 hours a day.
Yeah.
The police are still going to respond.
And don't domestic calls normally happen at night?
Overwhelmingly. Intoxicated persons, drug overdoses, and things like that. The majority of this activity happens at night.
Just one other question about policing, just in terms of demoralizing the police. Is that a real thing, or is that something that police use as a cover? Some have insinuated. Jack Dunphy, that's a pseudonym for a Southern California cop who, writing at the City Journal, wrote, I spent the latter half of my 30-year LAPD career as a supervisor encouraging officers to extend themselves in the effort to reduce crime. Given the present political climate, if I were still in that position, I couldn't offer that same encouragement in good faith. America's police have gotten the message. They're the problem, and they're responding accordingly. How many more lives will be lost before the country sees through this lie? How do you respond to that characterization of what Jack Dunphy would do if he were a supervisor today?
It seems fairly accurate. I was assigned to Cincinnati Division in early 2000s, right after there was a major confrontation there. There was some rioting. There were some individuals that were charged. It started as a result of a police shooting. And, the Department of Justice came in, and there was an agreement with DOJ and the Cincinnati Police Department to really scale back aggressive policing, to do They had to have a supervisor respond anytime there were hands on a subject. They had to fill out paperwork and give it to a special master. Police responded in the same way there for about 2 years. They just kind of responded to the most dire of emergencies, and crime went through the roof. And eventually it overcame itself. But that's what happens in these cases. I've said for a while, I think what you'll see is a two-tiered system with police response. And unfortunately, the worst of it is in these bigger cities where the police are really needed. That's where it's tough to be an officer. I think some of the more suburban departments, the areas out west, they won't suffer nearly as much of a morale drain and officers leaving the profession to go do something else. But I think in the bigger cities, it is going to be a problem, and you're hard-pressed to encourage young people to go do a very necessary job.
So in less than 6 weeks, we have the RNC slated to go to Jacksonville, Florida. Hopefully we will be there, or we've put in our applications to broadcast live from there. But what are local businesses doing to prepare themselves for any threats surrounding the RNC?
So it's pretty fast and furious because we're doing in 2 months what normally would be about 2 years worth of a run-up to do. And there's still a lot of unknowns. We don't know where the venues are going to be. As late as Friday, I was hearing discussions about maybe moving some of these things outdoors. COVID is still a big concern here. I can tell you outdoors in August in Jacksonville is not. First of all, you can't predict anything. Yeah. We do get thunderstorms every afternoon between 1 and 6. But yeah, I think that they need to nail down where the venues are going to be. We actually doing some crisis management planning. The company I'm with, FCS Global, because we're a sister company of a man guarding operation. We have a lot of downtown venues, courthouses, electric utilities, banks, mortgage companies, and things like that. So we want to have playbooks for all of our clients as to how to respond to as many different threats as we can think of.
I wanted to get your reaction to the FBI's conduct throughout the course of the Russian collusion investigation, and even since some of the personnel changes have been made against the backdrop of the Flynn prosecution that is still a pending matter, and of course the Roger Stone commutation over the weekend by President Trump. How you think your former agency has performed particularly at the upper reaches, and over the course of the last 3 years, and where you think it is today in terms of an agency that the American people should have faith in, again, leadership-wise?
Well, one, they should have faith, because there's too many good men and women in that 35,000-person organization who care passionately about what they're doing. And I dislike having to criticize the FBI, or criticizing, I don't have to. I dislike criticizing them because I spent 25 years there, and I love the organization. But I really do think comparing the way the organization worked and the rules for investigations and how the FBI stayed apolitical for 100 years, it's a shame to me to see what happened during that investigation. And I put it squarely on the blame of about 6 people at the top of the organization, maybe a few more. And I think it really did become political. I don't know why, but it did. I think it's very difficult to make any argument with a straight face that if you compare 2 investigations, one called Mid-Year Exam, which was the Hillary Clinton email case, and the second one called Crossfire Hurricane, which we all know was the Russia collusion case, they were handled 180 degrees differently from each other in terms of the hands-off prosecution, let a lot of things go by, no subpoenas, no search warrants, nobody gets arrested or prosecuted in one case, and very aggressive tactics to go after any process crime in the other. And even the Inspector General said he can't understand why that happened.
How unusual was the raid on Roger Stone's house? This is a alleged nonviolent offender, and he gets the full drug lord treatment.
Yeah, I mean, raids are hard for me to guess, or anybody I think that's not there, because I don't know what all the factors were in charge of in terms of threats or how they destruction of evidence potentially. So I don't really like to second guess raids because I'm not there, but that would probably be the least of the things I think that would be different or compared to Mid-Year Exam or the Clinton email investigation. And look, Roger Stone is he's not an easy character to defend. I know. I
don't want to defend him either. But this is precisely it. The assessment is always best against the people that we don't like, the people that are disreputable, because their constitutional rights are just as valid as my constitutional rights or yours. And this is where, in this country right now, we seem to be very cavalier about other people's constitutional rights if we don't like them. And that's a bad place to be.
Here's what I'd say about the Roger Stone prosecutions. I think the guy was prosecuted for lying about lying, and I don't think hardly anybody else would be prosecuted to that extent. That those were not, the lies he told were basically, about having been in touch with people he was never in touch with. And the whole point was to find out if he was in touch with those people.
But you do have some Republicans that are against it. Chris Christie, Mitt Romney, and even William Barr said that he wouldn't have agreed with the commutation of his sentence.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether I agree with it or not. I mean, I don't think he should have been prosecuted. So, should I then say he should go to jail? I mean, he was convicted in federal court by a jury of his peers. I get it, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't believe he should be prosecuted, that says a lot. As someone who was the head of a field office, a serious field office in this country, it says a lot about it. And I assume the situation with Michael Flynn is the same in terms of your view. That's even, to me, a much easier case to make out.
Well, I think the problem with the Flynn case was there were so many. There's so many instances where all the information wasn't turned over. And I mean, I really do think that having looked at the transcript, having looked at, the versions of the 302s that are out there, having looked at, the notes of the FBI agents and hearing Director Comey saying he didn't think that Flynn lied, and this was in January. Flynn doesn't get charged with lying until, a year later after it gets transferred to the special counsel's office. I think that, the squeeze was put on him to tell something that he knew about, again, something that didn't happen.
Speaking of the FBI, and not one of the people that was at the top of the food chain during this saga, but who was the special prosecutor? What about Bob Mueller's performance as the special prosecutor, former FBI man?
I worked for Bob Mueller directly. He promoted me twice. I have great affinity for the man. He's a patriot, bled for his country. But I just don't think that this was the last. I'm sorry, this was the last thing that he's going to be known for, because he really was a good leader of the FBI. A lot of us think that, after 9/11, he literally came in and saved the FBI from being broken up by making some much needed changes, by making the organization focus more on international terrorism, on counterintelligence, on cyber, and things like that. It does appear, from my vantage point, which is no different than anybody else outside the organization now, but, studying it a lot, that he probably wasn't totally in charge of this investigation. We saw the performance that he had in front of Congress defending the report. It wasn't stellar by Bob Mueller standards, I can tell you that. So I question who was really running the organization, or his special counsel team at the time.
He is James Casey, former police officer and FBI agent, served on the National Security Council, retired as special agent in charge of the FBI's Jacksonville decision, and he's still in Jacksonville helping with the RNC. He's currently president of FCS Global Advisors, a private investigative and crisis management firm. James Casey, thanks for joining us. Appreciate your insights.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.